I've done a lot of hiking in my life. Short trails, long ones, mountain hikes, desert treks, winter snowshoe routes, you name it. I've always found peace out there. Something about the silence of the woods or the openness of the highlands makes me feel like everything slows down. No noise from traffic, no calls from work, no notifications, nothing. Just wind, dirt, sky, and footsteps. That's probably why I didn't think twice about going alone. I had done solo hikes before, sometimes overnight, sometimes 3 or 4 days. I was careful. I brought all the gear, first aid kit, paper maps, extra food, water filter, all of it. This time, I was planning just a 2-day hike in the northern part of the state, in a stretch of forest that's not really famous but still remote and quiet. The place was called Lost Knife Ridge. Kind of a dramatic name, but the area wasn't as wild as it sounded. There was a trail system there, mostly used by hunters or hardcore hikers who didn't want the crowded routes. I'd only heard about it through a guy at a gear shop a few months back. He said the trail looped around through the forest, past a river, then along a ridge, and came back down through a stretch of rough boulders and pine. A total of about 23 miles. I figured I'd camp halfway in. I drove out on a Friday morning in August. I left early, beat the traffic, got there around 8:30 a.m. There were no other cars at the tiny trailhead lot, just mine and a broken-down RV parked to the side. Looked like it hadn't moved in months. That didn't bother me. I liked the quiet. I started walking around 9 o'clock. The trail was simple at first, just dirt packed down through some open woods. The air was warm, but not hot. I had my pack snug, a full water bladder, and a small GPS clipped to my chest strap. I wasn't worried. I had done way tougher hikes than this one. For the first 6 or 7 miles, it was just peaceful. Birds here and there, a few squirrels. I passed an old deer stand, half collapsed, probably hadn't been used in years. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. I stopped for lunch at the edge of a clearing and sat on a flat rock while I ate a peanut butter sandwich and a protein bar. By the time I reached mile 10, it was late afternoon. The ridge came up quick. A long, slow climb through thicker woods, and the sun dropped behind the trees. I started to sweat. It wasn't dangerous, just tiring. Roots were everywhere, and the trail wasn't always clear. Sometimes it split off, and I had to backtrack to stay on the main path. At around 6 p.m., I found a decent spot to set up camp. Flat enough, covered by pine, but open enough to cook safely. I didn't see any fire pits, but I didn't plan on a fire. I had a small stove and enough fuel. I pitched my tent, set out my sleeping pad and bag, and boiled some water for my dehydrated meal. I ate, cleaned up, packed the trash, and hung my food bag on a tree a bit away from the tent, just in case of animals. As night came in, I laid back and stared up at the sky through the gaps in the trees. Crickets started chirping. The air cooled down. It was the kind of peace I always looked for. But sometime in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I didn't sit up at first, just opened my eyes. It was pitch black. My watch said 2:12 a.m. I listened. There was a soft rustling outside the tent. Could have been a raccoon or maybe a deer, but it didn't stop. Kept circling the tent, slow and quiet. Not running, not charging. Just slow steps. I sat up, my heart starting to pick up. I grabbed my headlamp and flicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. The steps paused. I held still. Then I heard something that made me sit all the way up, more than one step. It wasn't one animal. There were at least 2, maybe more, moving around the tent. I didn't hear any growls, no heavy breathing. Just slow, careful steps, breaking twigs now and then. I waited about 10 minutes like that, my back stiff, eyes scanning every little sound. Eventually, the steps moved away. Not fast, just faded. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, everything seemed normal again. No signs of tracks near the tent, though the pine needles might have covered them. I ate quick, packed up, and got moving. I figured maybe it was deer or raccoons, or maybe coyotes passing through. I wasn't too spooked, just alert. The next part of the trail climbed up along the ridge, where it was more exposed. The view opened up, and I could see forest for miles. The sun was bright, and the wind picked up a bit, whistling through the trees. Around mid-morning, maybe 10:30, I came across something that didn't fit. There was an old jacket hanging from a tree branch, faded red, torn at the cuffs, looked like it had been there a while. Under it, off the trail, I saw a worn shoe, the kind with holes in the side. I didn't touch it, just looked. There was no pack nearby, no gear. I took a photo on my phone and kept walking. That kind of thing wasn't unheard of. Sometimes people dump junk in the woods, but it stayed in the back of my mind. By noon, I was about 15 miles in, deep in the forest, far from roads. I hadn't seen another person all day. I stopped by a creek to refill my water. I filtered it, filled up my bladder, then sat on a log to eat another sandwich. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Then I saw it. Across the creek, maybe 50 feet away, something was sitting in the brush. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a man. He was crouched down, elbows on his knees, just sitting, watching. He didn't move when I looked at him, just stared. I didn't say anything, didn't wave. I just stood up slowly, packed my trash, and started walking back to the trail. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't hear him leave. No snapping branches, no footsteps. My stomach twisted up tight. The next few miles were a blur. I hiked faster than I should have, checking behind me every couple minutes. Every little noise made me spin around. A squirrel, a bird, the wind. But each time I thought I saw something moving in the woods. By mile 18, I was physically drained. I should have stopped and rested, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to stop at all. I felt watched. At some point, I noticed that the trail markers were gone. I had been following red-painted blazes on the trees, but I hadn't seen one in a while. I slowed down, pulled out my map, checked the GPS. It was blinking, no signal. I hadn't taken a wrong turn, I was sure of it. But the trail looked off. Too narrow, too overgrown. I turned around to go back, but the trees looked the same. The way I came from didn't look familiar anymore. I started to panic. I knew better than to get emotional out there, but something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Then I smelled something. Rot came on fast, wet, sour, heavy in the back of my throat. I turned and pushed through the brush, trying to get back to where the trail was clearer. I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped cold. In the middle of the clearing was a dead animal. A deer, I think, torn open, flies buzzing, but it hadn't been there long. The blood was still fresh. I backed up, heart hammering. Then I heard the sound again, movement, steps, fast. Someone was running nearby. I didn't wait. I broke into a sprint, pushing through branches, ripping my sleeve on a branch. My pack bounced on my back. I ran until I couldn't anymore, until my lungs felt like fire. I collapsed behind a fallen log and laid flat. I listened. Silence. Then, something passed about 20 feet away. I didn't see them fully, just a flash through the trees. Pale skin, dirty clothes. They didn't have a pack, no gear. I waited for almost an hour before I moved again. When I finally stood up, I realized I had gone in the wrong direction. Everything looked unfamiliar. I checked my GPS again. Still no signal. I looked at the sun. It was getting lower. I was going to lose daylight soon. I started moving downhill, trying to follow the slope. Most trails followed ridges or valleys. I figured if I followed water, I'd find a trail again. By sunset, I had found a stream and was walking alongside it. My legs were shaking from exhaustion. Then I found something else. Another campsite. It looked like it had been used recently, maybe within a week. A fire ring, some burned sticks, even an old sock hanging from a branch. But no one was there. No tent, no bag, just signs of someone being there. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even set up my tent. I just sat behind a thick tree trunk, holding my knife, listening. Every twig snap made me flinch. At some point, I heard voices far off, not close enough to understand. Just a low murmur, too far to be real, or maybe too close. I stayed awake the whole night. By morning, I started walking again. My body ached. My feet were blistered. Around midday, I finally found something familiar. A marker. one of the red paint blazes. I've always been someone who enjoys hiking alone, not because I hate company, but because being out there by myself helps me think clearly. It gives me space. I like the quiet, the way the trees move with the wind, and the sound of my boots crunching the dirt. It makes me feel like I'm part of something older than all the things that go wrong in everyday life. No distractions, no deadlines, no people breathing down your neck. Last August, I took a week off work and drove from my apartment in the city to a national forest up north. I won't say the name of it because after what happened, I don't really want people going there trying to figure things out. The place isn't cursed or anything like that. It's just wild. Too wild for someone like me to be out there completely alone. I had done the same kind of trip before. Sleep in the car at the trailhead the first night, wake up early, pack up, and spend 3 or 4 days deep in the woods before heading back. Nothing fancy, just a good long hike and a chance to reset. This time, I picked a loop trail I'd never tried before. About 35 miles round trip, moderate difficulty, but with a couple of steep elevation sections. It was supposed to follow a river for a while, then loop up into some ridges and cut through some older pine forests on the way back. I packed my bag like always: tent, sleeping bag, 2 knives, first aid, water filter, 3.5 days of food, GPS unit, compass, 2 maps, solar charger, and some backup batteries. I always over-prepare. I even had an emergency beacon in my top pouch, in case I twisted an ankle or ran into a bear. The first day was fine, quiet, warm but not too hot. I passed a few other hikers early on, mostly heading the opposite direction. One older couple gave me a wave and I nodded back. By afternoon, I was about 12 miles in and hadn't seen anyone for hours. The trail ran along a narrow river, fast-moving water but clear, with smooth rocks and logs along the banks. I filled up my water bottles, filtered it, and kept going. I made camp before dark in a flat area above the river, maybe 50 feet from the water. The bugs were bad, but I had spray, and I made a little fire in the ring that someone else had built before me. I ate some jerky and rice, cleaned up, and sat there watching the fire until the woods went totally dark. The second day was tougher. There was a section of the trail that went almost straight uphill for about 2 miles. The dirt was dry and loose, and I had to take it slow. I kept slipping backward. My legs burned. My heart pounded. The air felt thinner up there. When I finally made it to the top of the ridge, I sat down on a rock and took a long break. I drank water, took off my boots to let my socks dry out, and just looked around. You could see for miles from up there, just hills, trees, and nothing else. No cell towers, no highways, no houses. I liked that. After that, the trail started to get narrow. There were parts where I had to squeeze through trees or watch my footing because the edge dropped off fast. I started seeing fewer trail markers, but I could still follow the path pretty well. It wasn't until late afternoon that I reached the place where everything started to go wrong. The trail split, but there was no sign, no marker, no paint on the trees. One path looked more traveled, packed dirt with a few scuffs. The other veered off to the left, a little overgrown but not completely wild. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out which was right. Based on my compass and the map, the trail should have turned east soon. The left path matched that. I double-checked my GPS, but for some reason it wouldn't connect. It just spun and said, "Searching satellites." I waited a few minutes, walked around, held it up. Nothing. I stood there for a long time. The right-hand trail looked easier, but it curved west. I decided to trust the map and go left. It felt right at the time. It really did. The first half-mile was fine. Then the trail started to disappear. The trees got closer together, and thorny bushes scraped at my legs. I pushed through slowly, thinking it would open up again, but it didn't. After another hour, I realized I wasn't on any trail anymore. I stopped walking and turned in a full circle. There was no path, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign anyone had ever been through this way. That's when I felt it, the heavy silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in nature where birds chirp and leaves rustle. This was flat silence. No birds, no insects, no wind. It felt wrong. I pulled out the GPS again. Still nothing. My stomach dropped. I didn't panic right away. I backtracked as best I could, trying to follow my own footprints, broken twigs, and crushed plants. But I must have gotten turned around at some point. Everything looked the same trees, same rocks, same patchy undergrowth. I kept moving, thinking I'd hit the river again or the ridge or any kind of landmark. But nothing showed up. The sun started to dip lower. That night, I made camp in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to waste energy or draw attention. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and lay there in the dark, listening. Still no birds, no bugs, just the faint sound of my own heartbeat and something else I couldn't place. A kind of low hum in the air, like pressure building behind your ears. I didn't sleep much. By the third day, I was trying to stay calm, but the panic had started to creep in. I kept moving east, hoping to cross back over the main loop trail. I checked the compass often. Still east. I moved slowly but steadily for most of the day, but it was like walking in circles. I kept ending up at the same rotten log, the same broken stump, the same little pool of water. I marked trees as I passed them, but even that got confusing because I'd come across marks I swore I didn't make, or I'd miss one I was sure I left behind. I saw signs of animals, scat, claw marks on trees, nests, but nothing fresh. No movement, no sounds. The woods felt dead. That afternoon, I slipped. There was a slope I had to cross, and the dirt gave out under my boots. I slid about 20 feet, hit a rock, and landed hard on my side. Pain shot through my ribs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I thought I'd broken something. I lay there, covered in leaves and dirt, gasping. After a while, I was able to sit up. Nothing felt broken, but every breath hurt. I got up slowly and limped to a flatter area. My left knee was swollen. I wrapped it with my spare bandage, but I could barely bend it. I camped there that night. I ate, drank, and tried to sleep, but the pain in my side and knee kept waking me up. I kept hearing sounds. Not voices, not animals, just movement. Twigs snapping. Something pacing in the trees. I stayed as quiet as I could, holding my knife in my hand. The next morning, I decided to use the emergency beacon. I turned it on, held it to the sky, and waited. The red light blinked. I left it on all day, but no rescue came. By the 5th day, my food was almost gone. I was eating dry rice, bits of trail mix, and drinking as much water as I could find and filter. My knee was worse. I couldn't move fast, and every step sent a jolt up my leg. I tried using a thick branch as a crutch. It helped a little, but I couldn't go more than a mile or two without having to stop and rest. That day, I found something that gave me hope. A footprint. Not mine. Not an animal. A human boot print in the mud near a tree. Fresh. Maybe a day old. I followed it. I followed it for hours, and then I lost it. It just vanished into dry leaves and hard ground. I spent another hour crawling around, looking for another print, but it was gone. I screamed, just let out all the frustration. My voice echoed back to me like the forest was mocking me. That night it rained. Cold, steady rain. I wrapped myself in my tent's ground cover and shivered through the night. My fingers went numb. Everything in my bag got soaked. I couldn't light a fire even if I wanted to. By the 6th day, I was starving. I ate the last of my trail mix and drank dirty water I didn't even bother filtering. I just wanted out. My knee was nearly useless by now. I had to drag it behind me. I used 2 branches as crutches, dragging my leg like dead weight. My ribs ached with every breath. That afternoon, I heard something, real movement, not the fake noises from before. I turned slowly and saw a black bear walking through the trees about 100 feet away. It didn't see me. It just kept walking, slow and tired looking. I let it pass, but that bear gave me something important. A direction. I figured if the bear was moving downhill, maybe it was heading to water, or maybe it knew where to go. I followed the direction it came from, not directly behind it, just the same general way. It was risky, but I didn't have many choices left. About 2 hours later, I heard it, the sound of water. A stream, narrow, shallow, but flowing. I dropped to my knees and drank. I filled up my bottle and kept following it downhill. That night, I slept on the cold ground next to the stream, wrapped in my wet tarp. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted the sun to come back up. I've always liked being alone in nature. Clears my mind. When I was younger, I'd go hiking every other weekend, sometimes even more. I wasn't some expert mountaineer, but I was careful. I packed right, I checked maps, I told people where I was going. I was never careless. But there's something about being too comfortable with nature. It makes you forget how dangerous it can get. You start thinking you're in control. That's the worst mistake you can make. It was late September, just before the cold really kicks in. I had a few days off and wanted to go somewhere quiet, where I wouldn't run into other hikers. I picked a remote valley in the northern Cascades, one that didn't show up much in trail guides. I'd seen it once mentioned on a forum, with someone saying it had a narrow trail, no signs, and wasn't maintained anymore. That's what I wanted. Quiet, solitude, no people. I downloaded some maps, took screenshots, marked coordinates, and packed food and gear for 3 days. I brought a hammock tent, a small stove, warm clothes, a headlamp, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a GPS tracker that I synced with my phone. The drive out was long, almost 6 hours. By the time I got to the Forest Service road leading to the trailhead, it was almost 4:30 in the afternoon. I knew I wouldn't get far before sunset, so I just hiked a short distance in and set up camp near a dry stream bed. The air was cold and damp. Leaves had started to turn. No bugs. Felt like the perfect trip. That first night went by quietly. I slept well. In the morning, I packed up, ate some oatmeal, and hiked deeper into the valley. The trail wasn't well-trodden, but you could still see it. It weaved through tall pine trees and across mossy clearings. In some places, dead branches had fallen across the trail, and I had to climb over or go around. About 4 hours in, I passed a small frozen pond. The surface was thin like glass. It looked untouched. The further I went, the quieter everything got. No wind, no birds, not even squirrels. It didn't feel threatening at that point, just weirdly still, like the world had been paused. I made it about 9 miles in by early evening. I found a flat spot under a large pine tree and set up camp, ate a freeze-dried meal and sat for a while, watching the last light slip behind the ridgeline. Then I climbed into the hammock tent, zipped up, and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I first woke up, but it was pitch black. I could hear something. A single, sharp snap of a branch, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. Then silence. It wasn't a falling branch. It sounded like a boot breaking a dry stick. I held my breath, listened, nothing else. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped out of the hammock and looked around. Nothing looked disturbed, but there were 2 small prints in the soft dirt near my tent. Could have been a deer, could have been a boot, but the shape wasn't clear. I brushed them over with my foot and shook it off. I kept hiking. The trail got worse, overgrown, rocky in some places and washed out in others. But I pushed forward. The terrain started changing, too. The trees thinned out, replaced by tall, yellowing grass and big rocks poking up from the ground. It reminded me of old riverbeds. Couple hours in, I found something strange. It was a torn piece of fabric, stuck on a low branch. Tan or gray, maybe part of a jacket. I looked around. No other sign of anyone. No boot prints. No gear. Just that one scrap. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Could have been old. I stuffed it into my side pocket. Around mid-afternoon, I started to realize something was off. My phone wasn't syncing with my GPS tracker anymore. I still had battery, but it just kept spinning, showing searching. I turned it off and back on. Nothing. I had my compass and map, but it still gave me a weird feeling. I hadn't passed any landmarks in hours. No peaks, no water features, just endless scrubby grass and trees. I kept moving. I wanted to make it to the next campsite I'd marked on the map, a small flat area near what used to be a seasonal creek. I found the flat ground easily enough, but the creek bed was bone dry and cracked. The wind had picked up a little. The grass waved like water, felt too open, but I didn't have much choice. I was tired, and the sun was getting low. That night, something changed. Around midnight, I woke up again. The wind had stopped completely, but I heard something, soft crunches, spaced out, circling my tent. I lay perfectly still, my ears tuned in. Step. Wait. Another step. Slow and measured. It made a full circle around me, then stopped. No more noise. I waited there for what felt like hours, too scared to even breathe loud. I had bear spray in my pocket, a knife in my boot. I didn't move. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. In the morning, I stepped out slowly, looking in every direction. The ground was disturbed. Dry grass bent down in a circle, maybe 6 feet out from my hammock. No clear footprints, just the shape of something walking around and around. I packed up fast and started hiking back toward the last solid waypoint I had marked. But the trail wasn't there. I went the way I'd come, or at least I thought I did, but the trees and terrain didn't look familiar. I retraced, tried different angles, climbed a small ridge to look down at the valley. Nothing helped. It was like the trail just didn't exist anymore. By noon, I had to admit I was lost. I wasn't panicking yet. I had food, water, shelter, a compass, and a map, but nothing matched. The sun was slightly hazy behind thin clouds, so I could still get general directions. I picked what I thought was southwest and pushed that way, aiming to cross paths with the main trail or a road. Hours passed. Still nothing. Then I found the rope. It was tied between 2 trees, about waist high, old, frayed, gray from exposure. No signs, no markings, just rope. Below it was a shallow depression in the grass, like something heavy had been dragged through over and over. I didn't cross it. I followed it instead. It stretched out, sagging for maybe 50 feet, then curved into the woods. The ground beside it had flattened grass in spots. I couldn't tell if it was from animals, people, or something else. Eventually, I came to a clearing. Not natural, flat ground, sharp angles. In the middle was a collapsed structure, just rotted boards and rusted metal scraps. Maybe it was a hunting cabin once, maybe something else. It didn't look that old, but weather had taken its toll. I circled it, checking for any tools, supplies, signs of people. There was nothing, but behind it was something worse. A small pit had been dug out behind the building, square and deep, like a trash hole or maybe an outhouse. But the sides were too clean, too smooth, and something metallic glinted at the bottom. I looked closer and saw a chain, a big one, heavy links, half buried in the dirt, running from one wall of the pit into the soil. I didn't want to see what was on the other end. I backed away and left the clearing fast. By now it was late, but I didn't want to sleep near that place. I kept moving, even though my legs were heavy and my shoulders ached. The air smelled different, more like rust. I hiked until it was too dark to see and set up camp in a dense patch of trees where I could barely fit the hammock. I didn't sleep. Every few minutes I thought I heard footsteps in the brush, or breathing, or the soft clink of metal. When daylight came, I packed everything and started moving again. I no longer had any sense of direction. I was just walking. By the second half of that day, I started rationing food. I still had water tablets and a filter, but the streams were all dry or muddy. I found one pool that looked safe and refilled, but I didn't stay there long. At one point, I spotted movement ahead. Finally, I thought someone else. A figure, upright, just past the tree line. But it wasn't a person. It was a tree, a half-burned stump shaped like someone standing. That was when I realized my mind was starting to slip. I sat down and forced myself to eat a protein bar, drink some water, and breathe. I was still okay, still alive, still walking. That night, I didn't set up the hammock. I just found a spot under some thick branches, laid out my bag, and kept my knife in my hand. I must have slept for a little, because I woke up to something cold on my face. It was ash, tiny flakes of it. I looked up and saw nothing. No fire, no smoke, no light, just black sky. But the air smelled burned, like a distant forest fire, or maybe something older. The next day, I started seeing things I couldn't explain. Not ghosts, not monsters, just things that shouldn't be there. a rusty metal bucket sitting in the middle of a trail, a sock nailed to a tree, a broken crutch half buried in the dirt. I tried to avoid them, but they were always near. By late afternoon, I spotted a dark line in the distance. I decided to hike the canyon loop trail in early October. It was one of those weekends where I had nothing planned, and I needed to clear my head. I had been working from home for months and felt like the walls were closing in. I'd seen some photos of the trail online. It wasn't too far from where I lived, just under a 2-hour drive. People said it was a scenic but isolated trail, about 15 miles round trip, going deep into a remote canyon and looping back through a ridge. That sounded perfect to me. I packed everything I needed the night before: 2 large water bottles, protein bars, jerky, a small first aid kit, flashlight with extra batteries, a compass, and my old but reliable hiking boots. I brought an emergency blanket and a whistle too, just in case. I left around 5:30 a.m. so I could start the hike right after sunrise. The drive was peaceful. I reached the trailhead at 7:15 a.m. The parking lot was empty. That didn't surprise me. This wasn't a touristy spot, and it was already late in the season. I locked my car, checked my pack again, and started walking. The trail started off as a gentle descent through pine trees and brush. The air was crisp, and the only sounds I heard were the crunch of gravel under my boots and birds moving around in the trees. After a couple of miles, the trees thinned out, and I started getting views of the canyon ahead. It was deeper than I expected, carved out by an old river that had mostly dried up now. The path zigzagged down into it, and I could see layers of red rock, narrow ledges, and dry creek beds below. I took my time going down. I stopped every now and then to take pictures or drink water. About 3 hours in, I reached the bottom of the canyon. There was a narrow path that ran along the old riverbed, winding between high rock walls that towered above me. The temperature had risen a bit, but it was still cool in the shade of the canyon. For a while, it was peaceful. The trail was mostly flat here, and I could hear the occasional buzz of insects or the scrape of lizards on rocks. But after an hour of walking along the canyon floor, I began to notice something strange. I hadn't seen a single person since I started, which wasn't too unusual. But what stood out was the silence. It was too quiet. Even the birds had stopped making noise. I chalked it up to the stillness of the place and kept going. About a mile later, I came across an old boot just off the trail. It was half buried in dirt, dried out from the sun. That struck me as odd. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe longer. I looked around for anything else but didn't see anything. No bag, no other shoe, no sign of a campsite or someone resting nearby. I stared at it for a while and then kept walking, trying to push it out of my head. The farther I walked, the narrower the canyon got. The walls closed in, and soon the path was just wide enough for me to pass through with rock pressing in on both sides. I had to squeeze past boulders in some spots, and in others, the trail disappeared for a while, forcing me to scramble over rocks and fallen branches. I came to a spot where the trail split into two. There were no signs, and both paths looked equally worn. I checked my printed map. It was old and didn't show the fork. I thought the path on the right looked a little more open, so I followed that one. That was a mistake. First, it wasn't too bad. The path continued through a dry wash filled with smooth rocks and sand. But then the wash curved and twisted, and soon I couldn't see the canyon walls clearly. The path got rougher and harder to follow. Eventually, I realized I wasn't on a trail anymore. I was just walking through a rocky ravine. I stopped and pulled out my compass. I tried to orient myself, but the high walls around me were throwing it off. It spun slightly even when I held still. I knew I should have turned back right then, but I figured if I just kept heading in one direction, I'd either run into the loop trail again or reach the ridge where the trail climbed back out. I kept going. The ground became steeper. Loose rocks made it hard to walk, and I had to keep my hands out for balance. At one point, I slipped and scraped my arm against a jagged stone. Blood trickled down, but I wiped it away and kept moving. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to think about being lost. By then, the sun had moved high overhead. It was almost 2 p.m. I knew I had to find the trail soon if I wanted to get out before dark. The wash I was in climbed sharply and eventually opened into a wide, flat shelf overlooking the lower canyon. I thought I'd be able to spot the trail from up there. I climbed up and stood on the ledge, breathing heavily. There was no trail, just more rocks, cliffs, and scattered brush. I turned in circles, scanning everything below and around me. I couldn't see any footprints, signs, or markers. All I saw was emptiness. I sat down on a flat rock and tried to stay calm. I wasn't out of supplies. I still had water, though I had been drinking a lot. I had some food left. The emergency blanket was in my pack, and I could use it if I had to stay out overnight. I reminded myself that I hadn't gone that far off the trail. Maybe a mile, maybe two at most. I could find my way back. I rested for 20 minutes, then picked a direction and started walking again. I tried to backtrack the way I had come, but the land didn't look familiar. The rocks all looked the same. The dry creek beds twisted and split, and every path looked like it could lead somewhere. But none of them did. I walked for 2 more hours, and the sun began to drop. The shadows stretched out across the rocks, and the air grew cold again. I climbed over a ridge and dropped into another narrow gully, hoping it would lead somewhere. That's when I saw it. A torn-up backpack leaning against a boulder. The top flap was open, and the fabric was faded from the sun. One of the straps was missing. I approached slowly. It looked like it had been there for a long time. Inside were some old granola wrappers, an empty water bottle, and a small journal, pages stuck together from what looked like old water damage. I didn't open the journal. I didn't want to know. That's when it hit me how serious things were. Someone else had come through here and never made it out. Their pack was left behind, and I had no idea where I was. I sat down again and tried to calm myself. I pulled out my whistle and blew it several times, long and sharp. The sound echoed, bounced around the rock walls, and then disappeared. I waited. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. It was getting dark fast. I didn't want to keep moving in the dark. I found a flat area near the base of a tall rock wall and set down my pack. I ate one of my protein bars and finished one water bottle. Then I pulled out the emergency blanket and wrapped it around myself. I lay down on my side, using my pack as a pillow, and tried to rest. Couldn't sleep. Every little noise made my ears perk up. Small rocks shifting, a twig snapping, wind whistling through cracks in the rocks. I stayed awake most of the night, shivering and staring up at the sky. The stars were bright, too bright. I had never felt so far from anything in my life. When the sun finally came back up, I felt groggy and sore. My legs ached from the day before, and my back was stiff from the cold ground. I stood up slowly and stretched, trying to shake off the fog. I had maybe a day's worth of water left. I knew I had to find the trail. I climbed back up the ridge I had come down the evening before. At the top, I saw something that stopped me cold. Far across the canyon, probably half a mile away, I saw movement. A person, or at least a figure, moving along a thin trail near the edge of the rocks. I waved both arms. I shouted, screamed, but they didn't turn around. They just kept walking. Either they didn't hear me or they weren't looking. Couldn't tell which, but I knew I had to get over there. I pushed myself hard. I went down into the gully, then scrambled up the far side, grabbing brush and pulling myself up ledges. My hands were raw. My legs were scraped, but I didn't care. I kept that trail in sight. It took nearly 2 hours to reach it. When I finally stepped onto the worn path, I almost cried. I recognized it. It was the original loop. I had found it again. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to keep going. I followed it up through a narrow slope and eventually reached the ridgeline that overlooked the canyon. From up there, I could see everything, and far in the distance, I spotted the parking lot. My car still there, a tiny speck of white against the green and brown. It still took 3 more hours to reach it. By the time I got back to my car, it was past 5 p.m., and the sun was just starting to dip again. My shirt was soaked in sweat. My lips were cracked. My arms and legs were covered in scratches and dirt. But I was back. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't even take off my boots. I just sat there and stared out the windshield. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the boot, the torn backpack, and the old journal. Someone else had gotten lost out there. Maybe more than one person. I don't know if they ever made it back, but I did. And I wasn't going to forget how easy it was to make one small decision, one wrong turn, and end up in a place where I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the stillness of the woods, the rhythm of my boots crunching dirt, the soft creak of my pack shifting with every step that helps me clear my mind. I'm not reckless. I plan, I prepare, I tell people where I'm going. But even the most careful person can make one stupid mistake. I made mine last fall in northern Montana. I had taken some time off work after back-to-back months of stress. My head felt like it was always spinning, and my sleep had been off for weeks. So I booked a cabin for 2 nights and planned a long solo hike in the mountains. The trail I chose was remote but legal and well documented. A 17-mile out-and-back trail that had a reputation for being challenging but rewarding. Not too crowded, mostly because it was late October and temperatures had started to drop. I started early that morning, maybe a little before 7 a.m. The sun was just coming up. I had my GPS, map, headlamp, plenty of water, snacks, a first aid kit, an emergency whistle, extra clothes, even bear spray. The air was cold and clean, and frost clung to the pine needles like tiny glass shards. I remember taking a deep breath and smiling as I hit the trailhead. My legs felt good. I knew I'd finish before dark. The trail started with a steady incline, winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. Leaves and pine needles had piled up across the trail in places, but the path was still easy to follow. Every so often, the trees opened up to views of the valleys below and jagged peaks ahead. I passed a small creek about an hour in, stopping to refill my bottle with my filter pump. That's when I saw the first sign of something off. A torn hiking boot, just one, half buried in mud near the edge of the bank. It looked old, maybe waterlogged and weathered from being there for weeks. I stared at it for a few seconds. It could have been anything. A dropped boot someone never came back for, or even a bear dragging it off after someone tossed it. I took a picture just in case, marked it on my GPS, and kept going. The higher I climbed, the more the air thinned and the colder it got. At some point around 10:30 a.m., I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on the map. It wasn't a wide split, just a thin offshoot heading off toward the northeast, through tighter trees and overgrown brush. It looked like a game trail. I shouldn't have even given it a second glance, but I did. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was just looking for more solitude, though I hadn't seen another person all morning. What made me leave the main trail, I don't know. There was no sign, no tape, nothing. Just that narrow, tempting path snaking into the trees. I thought I could follow it a little ways and come back. Maybe it led to a viewpoint not on the map. The first 30 minutes off the main trail were calm. The new path was rougher and more wild, but I kept track of my position. I told myself I'd go a mile in and turn back. I passed a few deer tracks, maybe elk. At one point, I startled a grouse, and it shot out from the underbrush with a noise that nearly made me jump out of my skin. That should have been my sign to go back, but I kept walking. The trees were tighter here, and the shadows heavier. I hadn't noticed how thick the cloud cover had gotten until the wind picked up and I realized I couldn't see the sun anymore. I reached a small clearing not long after, and that's when I heard something that made my heart stop, metal on metal. A faint clinking sound, like someone messing with gear or tapping 2 carabiners together. I froze, listening. Came from the woods just ahead and to my left. I couldn't see anyone, but the noise repeated, irregular and slow. Then silence. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, holding my breath, scanning the trees. I didn't hear it again. No birds, no wind, nothing. I called out once, just in case someone was there and needed help. But there was no answer. I felt stupid for getting spooked, but I turned around and started heading back toward the main trail. Only I couldn't find it. At first, I thought I just needed to walk further west. My GPS still showed my breadcrumb trail, but the satellite connection flickered every few minutes. I moved in the direction I came from, but everything looked the same. Pines, low brush, fallen logs. I checked the GPS again. Still no signal. I pulled out my map and compass, but the trees had twisted my sense of direction. I walked fast, convinced I could find the fork again. My breathing got heavier. The wind picked up again, this time with more bite. The silence felt unnatural. I started to panic. I stopped walking and forced myself to calm down. I drank water, ate a protein bar, and used the compass to move southwest, toward where I knew the trail had to be. After 30 minutes, I found a tree with a thick scar running down its trunk. I didn't recognize it. I checked my GPS again. Finally, it had a signal. But the breadcrumb path I'd followed wasn't matching the terrain anymore. Either I'd walked in the wrong direction or the signal had been off when I marked it. I was deeper than I thought. I told myself to stay put and wait for the satellite to lock again. I found a small flat area near a downed log and sat down. I checked the time, 12:42 p.m., still hours until dark. I decided to stay there for 15 minutes. If the GPS still didn't help, I'd backtrack manually using landmarks. But as I sat there, I heard it again. That same sound, metal on metal. Clink, pause, clink. But this time it was closer, maybe 30 or 40 feet to my right. I stood slowly, looking through the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped again. I didn't want to be there anymore. I picked a direction and moved. I didn't run, but I walked fast. Every now and then I glanced behind me. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. That slow-growing dread that crawls up your spine when something is wrong and your body knows it before your brain does. I was being watched. I didn't have proof, but I knew. I walked for what felt like hours. The light started to change. Shadows got longer. My hands were cold now. My water was running low. At some point, I realized I'd done a full loop or something close to it because I found the same scarred tree again. I swore out loud. I was going in circles. The GPS had no fix again. The battery was down to 19%. I tried to calm down. I set up a crude marker with a stick and my emergency tape tied to a branch. Then I followed a straight line south, checking every few minutes to make sure I didn't veer. It worked for a while. I moved downhill through tighter woods, over a rocky slope that nearly made me fall twice. I thought I was getting close to the creek from earlier. Then I found something that made me stop again. Another piece of gear, a torn strap from a backpack, hanging from a tree branch like someone had hooked it there. It wasn't weathered. It looked new. The nylon was still stiff, and the stitching was only slightly frayed. I took a photo and kept moving. I stumbled onto a deer carcass maybe 15 minutes later. At first, I thought it was just bones, but the meat was still fresh in places. Flies buzzed around the eyes and open ribcage. The spine had been bent at an unnatural angle. The legs were broken. I don't know why, but the sight of it almost made me cry. I'd seen dead animals before on hikes, but something about this one felt wrong. There were no drag marks. It hadn't been eaten properly, like a predator would do, just broken and left there. The smell was horrible, but I made myself look around. No human prints, no bear tracks, just the crushed grass and some scuffed dirt. I kept moving, faster now, half walking, half jogging. The sun was setting. I pulled on my jacket and gloves. The wind had turned sharp, and my breath came out in thick clouds. I knew I wasn't going to make it out before dark. I had no cell signal, no GPS signal. I had two options: keep trying to find the trail, or make camp and wait for morning. I didn't want to spend the night there. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of a branch sounded like a footstep. But moving in the dark was worse. So I found a flat patch under a thick tree and made camp. I cleared the ground, used my emergency blanket and sleeping bag, and set up a small fire with my kit. I didn't cook anything. I just sat there in silence, staring into the flames, clutching my bear spray. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. I kept hearing soft snaps in the trees. Once, I heard something crunch leaves just beyond the light of the fire. It moved slow and steady. Then it stopped. I held my breath. It didn't come closer, but it didn't move away either. I sat there, frozen, for nearly half an hour. Then, just before dawn, I heard something running. Fast, heavy steps crashing through the brush. Not toward me, just nearby. Something was chasing something else. I never saw it. The noise faded into the trees, and then everything went silent again. As soon as the sky turned gray, I packed up and moved. My hands were shaking from cold and fear. I followed the slope east until I saw something that made me drop to my knees. An orange trail marker nailed to a tree. Faded but real. I've hiked alone plenty of times before. I'm careful about it. I pack right. I check weather forecasts. I mark my trail on both paper maps and GPS apps. I leave notes with people. I don't mess around with risky terrain or unknown areas. But in early September last year, I made a mistake. I let my curiosity take over. I went off-trail just because I thought I found a shortcut. That one stupid decision turned into the worst experience of my life. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day hike through the upper parts of the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. The trail wasn't too popular, which I liked, and I'd done parts of it years ago. I had a good feel for the area. This time I planned to loop north, camp near a high alpine lake the first night, push through a steep stretch on day 2, and come back around on a narrow trail that would lead me back to my truck. Everything was planned. I even checked in with the ranger station before heading out. The first day went fine. I parked my truck at the empty gravel lot around 8 a.m., signed in at the trail register, threw on my pack, and started up the path. The sun was bright but not too hot. The forest felt clean and quiet, that kind of peacefulness you only get far from roads. I made great time. The trail rose gently for the first few hours, weaving through tall pines and over patches of granite. Birds chirped, squirrels darted across the trail. At one point, a deer stood still just off to the side of the path and stared at me before vanishing into the trees. Around 4 p.m., I reached the lake where I planned to camp. It was a crystal clear pool of water cradled between cliffs. No one else was there. I found a flat, grassy spot maybe 30 yards from the water's edge and set up my tent. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and just sat outside for a while, watching the light shift on the lake. That night, the stars were unreal. With no light pollution, they stretched across the whole sky like a glittering sheet. The second morning, I woke early and broke camp fast. This part of the trail went up sharply, switchbacking through dense pine forests and over rocky outcroppings. I stopped for water a few times and checked my GPS regularly. Everything lined up with my map. The air felt colder as I climbed, and clouds started to build. By noon, I was high up on a ridge with a wide view of the valleys below. It was quiet up there. No wind, no birds, just my boots on gravel and the sound of my breathing. That's when I saw it. Just a little below the trail, on a kind of side slope covered in loose rocks and shrubs, there was a faint path I didn't remember. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't showing on my GPS either. But it looked like a real trail, narrow, slightly worn, like it had been used long ago. Maybe it was an old miner's path or something from logging days. I stared at it for a while, thinking. My planned trail looped around for another 5 miles before dropping back down. But this side trail looked like it could cut off a big chunk of distance. It seemed to lead straight into the valley I needed to get to. I knew I shouldn't leave the main trail. I knew it, but I was tired, and the clouds were growing darker. And I told myself I'd just go a little ways down and see if it connected. If it got bad, I could turn around. That was the plan. I stepped off the main trail and started down the narrow path. The ground was softer here, and the plants thicker. After about half a mile, the slope got steeper, but the trail held. I kept going, ducking under fallen branches, stepping over loose rocks. The forest changed too. The trees grew closer together, thicker trunks, darker bark. Less light made it through the canopy. There were fewer signs of animals, and I stopped hearing birds. By the time I realized the trail was dropping too fast, it felt too late to turn back. The slope was too steep. My legs were tired. I didn't want to fight my way back uphill. I checked my GPS, but the screen just showed empty terrain. No trails, no landmarks. I pulled out my compass. I was still heading roughly west, the direction I needed, so I kept moving. The trees got stranger as I went. Their branches twisted in odd ways, like they'd been warped by wind or snow, but I didn't feel any wind. The undergrowth got thicker. The dirt smelled different, damper, almost sour. The trail itself was barely visible at this point, just patches of flattened ground weaving through the brush. I slipped a few times. Once I went down hard, sliding on wet leaves and slamming my shoulder into a tree trunk. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, and looked around. Everything looked the same in every direction. Trees, brush, shadows. I couldn't see the sky anymore. I was sweating even though the air felt cold. I pushed on. I didn't feel good about it, but I didn't want to stop. I kept telling myself I'd reach a clearer path soon. But the ground turned to soft mud. My boots started sinking. There were old logs covered in moss that crumbled when I touched them. Everything was wet. The trail vanished completely. I stopped, pulled out my map again, tried to match any landmarks, but there was nothing. Just empty space. No ridges, no creeks, nothing matched. I had a sinking feeling in my chest. Not panic, not yet, but a slow realization that I was lost. I tried to backtrack. I turned around, looked for broken branches, footprints, anything. But the forest swallowed everything. Every direction looked the same. The light had changed too. It felt like late afternoon, but my watch said it was barely 1:30. Clouds had blocked out the sun, and the forest had gotten dark fast. That's when I heard something. Not an animal, not footsteps, just a dull thudding sound far off, like something hitting the ground, maybe a tree falling. Then silence. I stood still for a long time, listening. My mouth felt dry. The air was thick. I couldn't hear any insects or birds. I kept moving west using my compass. I slipped down a muddy slope, caught myself on roots, crawled under a rotten tree. At some point, I realized I wasn't even sure if I was going west anymore. The compass needle kept jittering. I'd never seen that happen before. Around 4 p.m., I knew I wasn't going to make it back to the main trail. I hadn't seen anything man-made in hours. No signs, no trash, not even a broken branch that looked fresh. I set up my tent in a patch of semi-level ground between two leaning trees. Everything around me felt damp, even my sleeping bag. I boiled some water, but I didn't feel like eating. That night was the worst. I heard things outside the tent. Cracks, thuds, rustling leaves. Not animals. Heavier than that. Once, I swear I felt something brush the outside of the tent. But when I looked out with my headlamp, there was nothing. Just wet trees and thick fog. I barely slept. When the morning came, it didn't feel like morning. The light was dim. Fog had rolled in thick, and I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. I packed up, moved slow, followed the compass again. I tried climbing higher to get some visibility, but every slope I picked led me deeper into thick trees or rocky dead ends. I slipped again and tore the side of my pack on a broken branch. I kept going that whole day, eating little, drinking less. The fog lifted around noon, but I still couldn't find any landmarks. I tried using my GPS again. Nothing. Kept searching for signal, but never connected. I remember kneeling next to a fallen tree, trying to fix the torn strap on my backpack, when I saw it. An old wooden post, half-rotted and leaning at an angle. It had no sign on it, just a splintered piece of wood sticking out of the ground. But it meant something. People had been here once. I followed the direction it pointed, hoping it was part of an old trail. I pushed through another thick patch of trees and found more posts. Not many, but enough. Most of them were broken or falling apart, and they didn't lead anywhere clear, but they gave me hope. That night I camped again, still deep in the forest, still lost, but with some sense that I was near something. Maybe a forgotten road or an old fire line. I had one freeze-dried meal left and only half a bottle of clean water. The next day, the forest started to change again. The trees got smaller, younger. The ground firmed up. I saw rocks that looked shaped like part of an old wall. And then, finally, around 1 p.m., I saw a shape through the trees. Something square and man-made. It was a collapsed cabin. The roof had caved in long ago. The wood was black with age and moss covered most of it. But it was real. I searched around it, hoping for a trail or some sign. Behind it, I found a path, barely visible, overgrown, but it was straight, deliberate, and I followed it. That path led me down a long hill and eventually came out onto a gravel Forest Service road. I don't know how far I hiked that day, maybe 8 miles. I limped most of the way. My legs were done. My feet were blistered. I cried when I saw a parked truck by a locked gate at the end of that road. I followed it out, and 4 hours later, I found the main road and flagged down a pickup. They took me to a ranger station 20 miles away. I had been missing for 2 days longer than I thought. My GPS. I've always enjoyed hiking alone, not in a thrill-seeking kind of way, not because I'm chasing adrenaline or trying to find some hidden part of myself in the trees. Nothing dramatic like that. I like the quiet. I like the way the wind feels on my skin when I'm up high, the ache in my calves after a long climb, and the strange sense of calm that comes with being out in the woods where no one can reach you. I work in an office all week, so when the weekend rolls around, I grab my pack and disappear into the forest. That's how I ended up on Ridge Trail last fall. I took a Friday off, packed everything Thursday night, and drove out early that morning to beat the weekend crowd. Ridge Trail wasn't one of the more well-known spots in the area. It was tucked into a corner of the forest preserve that didn't get much foot traffic. I'd read about it on an old hiking forum post, just a few paragraphs someone had written years ago, but the pictures they attached showed a winding, narrow trail snaking along a high ridgeline that overlooked a deep valley. That view had stuck in my mind. I wanted to see it for myself. The trailhead was a gravel lot with room for maybe 6 cars. When I arrived, it was empty. That was fine with me. I liked it that way. I parked, stretched, and shouldered my pack. The air was sharp and cool, the sky cloudless and pale blue. I locked my car, made sure my GPS watch was set to track, and started walking. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail dipped into a patch of pine forest, where the ground was soft with brown needles, and the only sounds were the breeze and the birds. Every now and then, the trees would open up, and I'd catch a glimpse of the valley far below, the hills beyond it rolling away like frozen waves. It felt like I was the only person for miles. I moved steadily, checking my map every hour, sipping water as I went. I planned to hike about 10 miles out to a small flat clearing near the ridge, where I'd set up camp, spend the night, and hike back early the next morning. The entire trail looped, but the full loop was over 20 miles, and I didn't want to push it. I was alone, and I wasn't taking chances. Around midday, I found a wide rock outcropping that jutted out from the trail and gave me a clear view of the valley. I dropped my pack and sat there to eat. Just a sandwich, some trail mix, and water. The sun was high, and the wind had picked up slightly. The view was everything I had hoped for. After a while, I packed up and kept going. As I got further along, the trail narrowed. It climbed more steeply, and the terrain got rougher. There were spots where the dirt was loose and dry, and I had to slow down to avoid slipping. A few places had old, rotted wooden steps sunk into the slope, but many were missing or half buried. The forest thickened around the trail, and the ridgeline loomed ahead. That's when things started to feel different. Not wrong exactly, but off. There were fewer birds. The wind had died down. The trees grew close together, and the trail seemed more overgrown. At first, I figured I'd just gotten farther than most people usually hiked. Maybe this part of the trail hadn't been maintained in years. Then I noticed something strange. A boot print, not mine, in the dirt just ahead. It was old, half erased by weather and time, but it was there. Someone else had come through this way, and not recently. A few feet later, I saw another. They led up the path, vanishing into the undergrowth. I kept going. I wasn't worried, but I started paying closer attention. I scanned the trees more often, listened for sounds behind me. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything but my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. By the time I reached the spot I planned to camp, the sun was already dipping low. The clearing was barely a clearing at all, just a flat spot between 2 thick clusters of trees. I dropped my pack and looked around. There was a half-collapsed fire ring in the center, old black stones with bits of charcoal. Someone had camped here before, but not in a long time. I set up my tent quickly. I boiled water for a dehydrated meal and sat with my back against a tree to eat. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you. I wasn't scared, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening harder than usual. I didn't sleep much. Every small sound outside, every creak of the trees, every shuffle of leaves, snapped me awake. My mind kept drifting to those boot prints. Who left them? How long ago? Were they still around? Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not wind. Heavy, deliberate footfalls crunching on dry leaves, just outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay frozen, heart thudding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The steps came closer. Then they stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I finally sat up slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just sat there, listening, holding my breath. Eventually, I forced myself to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just darkness and trees. But I knew what I heard. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting upright, gripping the flashlight in one hand and the knife from my pack in the other. When morning came, I packed up in record time. I didn't even eat. I just stuffed everything into my pack and hit the trail. I didn't look back. I hiked fast, barely stopping for water. My body was stiff from no sleep, and my legs burned from the pace, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be off that ridge. The trail felt different on the way back. Shadows seemed longer. The trees seemed thicker. I was maybe 4 miles from the trailhead when I found the torn backpack. It was shoved partway under a bush beside the trail. The fabric was sun-bleached and shredded, one strap hanging by threads. I stopped, heart hammering again, and stepped closer. There was nothing inside. No ID, no food, no gear. Just a torn, empty pack. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Then I took out my phone and tried to call for help. No service. I didn't touch the bag. I took a picture of it, marked the location on my GPS, and kept moving. Faster now. Every instinct in me screamed to get out. When I finally saw the parking lot, I nearly cried. My car was the only one there. I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped in, and locked the doors. Once I had a signal again, I called the local ranger office. I told them everything, the trail, the clearing, the footsteps, the backpack. I sent them the GPS coordinates and the picture. They said they'd send someone out. A week later, I got a call back. They said the bag had been there for years. Belonged to a hiker who'd gone missing in 2016. Never found. No sign of remains. Just his abandoned campsite, miles off trail. No answers. They thanked me and said they'd added my report to the file. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I still go out sometimes, but always with friends. Always on marked, well-used trails. Ridge Trail isn't listed on most maps anymore. They closed that section a few months after my call. I never found out who or what I heard outside my tent that night. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it wasn't. But I know what I felt. I've hiked for years. I've camped alone dozens of times. I've dealt with wild animals, storms, even minor injuries. But nothing ever made me feel the way I felt that night on the ridge. I wasn't alone out there. And whatever was out there with me, it wasn't just passing through. I don't like talking about this hike, not because it was supernatural or some made-up horror thing, but because it was one of the most exhausting, terrifying, and eye-opening experiences I've ever gone through. It happened about 2 summers ago in late August. I was 29 at the time and had been hiking solo for over 5 years. I wasn't new to the outdoors. I knew how to read maps, use a compass, pack light but smart, and handle basic emergencies. But none of that fully prepared me for this one. Started out like any other trip. I had taken a week off from work and planned to do a 3-day loop in a national forest in the northwest part of the country. I won't say the name, but it's known for thick forests, steep climbs, and long, quiet trails. I picked a route that looped about 34 miles. There were plenty of creeks along the way, a couple of backcountry campsites, and some side trails that looped back to the main trail. I printed out a topographic map, packed my gear, food, and water filtration system, and drove out early one morning. The parking lot at the trailhead was almost empty when I arrived. Just 2 other cars there. It was a weekday, so I wasn't surprised. That's what I liked anyway, less people. I signed in at the trail register, strapped on my pack, and started walking around 7:15 a.m. The air was cool and damp. I could hear birds, the wind in the trees, the usual forest noises that give a strange peace at the beginning of a trip. The first day was easy. I covered about 11 miles and made camp near a creek. I saw deer, a couple of squirrels, and fresh boot prints on the trail, probably from someone ahead of me. I made dinner, filtered water, and slept early. It was so quiet I didn't even need earplugs. I was deep enough that no traffic sounds could reach me, just the sound of water and trees creaking when the wind blew. The second day was longer, about 13 miles. The trail got steeper in some areas, and there was a point where I crossed an old bridge that looked like it hadn't been repaired in years. I made it across slowly, testing every plank. A fall there would have been about 20 feet into rocks and water. I took my time and made it over. Camped that night in a small clearing away from the trail. Still no people. I saw old fire rings, but no fresh tents or anything. The third morning is when it all went off track. Literally. I had about 10 miles left to finish the loop and make it back to my car. I woke up at dawn, packed up, and hit the trail by 6:30 a.m. I was a few miles in when I saw a sign nailed to a tree that said, "Cut off trail, 3.8 miles to trailhead." It wasn't on my map. The sign looked old, but not ancient. It was crooked, and the wood was gray from age. I paused. The idea of cutting off 2 miles sounded great. I'd finish earlier and maybe even stop for a meal on the way home. I looked at my map again. No cutoff trail was marked. Just a winding part of the main loop that curved west, then back around to the trailhead. I should have stayed on the main loop, but I didn't. I took the cutoff. Started off okay. Narrower, but still a real trail. Definitely used by people before. A little overgrown in parts, but nothing unusual. I kept going, stepping over fallen branches, walking around a few muddy patches. Then the trail started descending sharply. I found myself going downhill fast, switchback after switchback, until I realized I'd lost elevation fast. That wasn't right. The parking lot was at a higher point. I looked back uphill. The trail was still there, so I figured maybe it dipped before climbing again. About 40 minutes in, I stopped for water and looked around. I didn't like what I saw. The trail had thinned out, almost no footprints. It was surrounded by thick underbrush on both sides, the kind of overgrowth that brushes your legs when you walk. I kept going, thinking it might widen out again soon, but it didn't. Instead, it began to twist around rocks and trees, and I noticed more fallen branches and logs blocking the path. Not like it hadn't been maintained recently, but like it had been forgotten entirely. After an hour and a half, I knew something was wrong. I pulled out my map again. No sign of this trail. I turned on my phone to use GPS. No signal. Not even one bar. I tried using the downloaded offline map app, but it couldn't locate me. I figured I'd just turn back. That's when the trail disappeared completely. Gone. Just brush. No clear path. It had slowly faded without me noticing. I froze. I turned around, walked back maybe 40 feet. Nothing but trees and weeds. No trail. I started to feel something deep in my chest. Not panic yet, but something close. My body stiffened. I dropped my pack and stood there, listening. No wind. No birds. Just my breath. I told myself to calm down. I took a deep breath and tried to retrace every step. I found what looked like a trail, followed it for about 10 minutes, and ended up in a dead-end hollow full of rocks and ferns. I backtracked again, circling slowly, trying not to crush any plants I might need to recognize again. By noon, I was completely turned around. My legs were scratched and my arms were too. The brush was dense. I climbed a small slope, thinking I could get a better view from the top. But all I saw were trees. More trees. Not even the sound of a road or stream. Just forest. Deep, endless forest. Then the fear really kicked in. I was sweating, not from heat but from nerves. My shirt clung to me, I was low on water. I took sips slowly. I ate a granola bar but couldn't taste it. I realized how quiet everything was, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I spent the next couple hours trying to find anything that looked like a trail. Anything. I circled, marked trees with rocks, broke branches, even tried to make arrows on the ground with sticks. But the forest seemed to fold in on itself. Everything looked the same. That night, I set up my tent in a small flat spot under some pine trees. I didn't eat, just drank some water and tried to rest. I kept thinking about mountain lions or bears, even though I'd never seen one on this side of the forest. I didn't sleep much. Every sound made me jump. I woke up at least 10 times. The next morning, I got up at dawn and started walking in a straight line east, at least what I thought was east based on the sun. I figured if I kept heading that way, I'd hit the main trail or a road eventually. But by afternoon, I was still lost. I found a dried up creek bed and followed it for miles. Still nothing. The trees never stopped. No openings. No signs. My feet were aching. My legs were cramping. My lips were dry. I drank the last of my filtered water and tried collecting more from a shallow puddle. Tasted like mud. I spent a second night in the woods. I built a small fire just for light and heat. My hands shook as I lit it. I kept thinking about how no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone I might take a shortcut. No one would come looking on the cutoff. On the fourth day, I got lucky. I was walking slowly, exhausted, when I saw something sticking out from under a fallen tree. Piece of metal. I pushed the branches aside and saw an old rusted trail marker. The wood had snapped and rotted, but I could still read the letters faintly. Main loop, 2.4 miles. My knees buckled. I cried, not loud, just tears and shaking. I followed the direction it pointed, stepping over logs, walking through brush. After an hour and a half, I found the actual trail. Clear as day, flat, packed dirt, real trail. I dropped to my knees again and just sat there for a while. From there, I walked the last miles like a zombie. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I barely drank. When I saw my car, I couldn't believe it was real. I opened the door, sat inside, and just stared forward for a long time. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't want to talk about how stupid I'd been, how easily I could have died just by following an unmarked trail, how I had no cell service, no signal, no help, just me and the forest. And the forest didn't care if I made it out or not. It wasn't a ghost story or some creature in the woods. It was worse. It was real. Just me getting lost, almost giving up, and somehow making it out by chance. I never found that cutoff on any official map. I don't know who made the sign. Maybe it was part of an old trail system decades ago. Maybe someone nailed it there as a prank. I don't know, and I'll never try to find out. What I do know is this: when you're deep in the woods, there are no second chances. One bad decision can turn a peaceful hike into something else entirely. I still hike, but I don't take shortcuts anymore, ever. I've done a lot of hiking over the years, but what happened on that solo trip through Green Dust Canyon in Arizona still sticks with me like thorns under the skin. It wasn't the highest climb I've ever done. It wasn't the longest either, but it was the one that taught me what fear really feels like. Not fear of wild animals or running out of water, but fear that rises when you realize how easily things can go wrong and how alone you really are. I planned the hike for mid-May. Temperatures were warm, skies were clear, and the tourist season hadn't fully kicked off yet. I liked it that way. I'm not antisocial or anything. I just prefer the quiet. No kids yelling, no hikers blasting music on portable speakers, no crowds at lookout points. Just me, my gear, and miles of trail ahead. Green Dust Canyon wasn't a famous destination. It was off the usual hiking grid, and most people overlooked it in favor of the Grand Canyon or Monument Valley. But I had read about it in an old hiking forum post, and something about the photos, tight canyon walls, twisting red paths, and remote beauty pulled me in. I drove out from Flagstaff early in the morning. The trailhead was a barely marked dirt pull-off next to a faded wooden sign. I double-checked my supplies before heading out. A full hydration pack, 2 backup water bottles, 3 energy bars, a headlamp, small med kit, a multi-tool GPS topographic map, compass, and a battery bank for my phone. I also carried a small emergency beacon I rented just in case. I wasn't careless. The trail started easily enough. Smooth dirt, low shrubs, gentle descent. After the first mile, the path narrowed and curved into the canyon itself. Towering red stone walls rose on both sides, creating shade that helped against the sun. I loved the way the sandstone seemed to shift colors as the light moved. Sometimes orange, sometimes deep red. It was beautiful. About 3 hours in, I stopped for lunch near a shaded boulder and checked the GPS. I was exactly where I expected to be. There was a narrow offshoot of the trail about a mile ahead that would take me to a small spring marked on the map. I figured I'd refill my water there, rest for a bit, and decide whether I wanted to camp overnight or start heading back by late afternoon. I made it to the spring by 2:30 p.m. It was barely a trickle coming out of the rocks, but it was enough to refill my bottles using a filter. I sat for a while, listening to the stillness. No wind, no birds, no insects buzzing, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional drip of water. It was peaceful, but in a strange way also unnerving. After maybe 30 minutes of rest, I packed up and decided to take a shortcut marked on the topographic map. It wasn't an official trail, more like a dry creek bed that cut across the canyon and rejoined the main trail about 5 miles ahead. It would shave off a good hour of hiking and offer a new view. I figured as long as I kept checking the map and compass, I'd be fine. The shortcut started wide and dry, easy to follow. The ground was sandy and soft, with footprints from past hikers and maybe some deer or coyotes. I moved steadily, making sure to check behind me often so I could backtrack if needed. But about a mile in, the walls of the wash tightened. The path narrowed, and the canyon walls on either side started to rise again. It got darker, cooler. The ground grew rockier, uneven. That's when I noticed the first sign of trouble. The map didn't show this area being so narrow. I stopped, checked the compass, and realized I had drifted slightly west of the original creek bed. I turned to go back and correct course, but the way I had come now looked unfamiliar. The light had shifted, and every bend in the canyon looked like the last one. Still, I didn't panic. I had the GPS after all. I pulled it out and waited for it to find signal. Nothing, just a loading icon blinking. I tried again, walked in a circle for a bit, but still no connection. My phone had 1 bar and wasn't showing any location either. That canyon must have been deep enough to block signals. Fine. I went analog, compass and map. Problem was, the terrain had changed too much from the map. Maybe erosion or a rockfall had altered the landscape since the map was made. I tried to reorient myself, but with the narrowness of the walls and the twists in the path, it was nearly impossible to tell which way was north. Everything looked the same. Red rock, sand, scattered brush. I kept moving, hoping to find higher ground for a better signal or a clearer view. That's when I noticed the quiet again. Not peaceful this time, just quiet in a way that felt wrong, like everything around me was holding its breath. I climbed up a sloped rock to try and see over the canyon walls, but all I got was more red rock and sky. No trail, no landmarks, no footprints except my own. I sat down and tried to collect myself. It was around 4 p.m. now. Still plenty of daylight, but I had to find a way out before dark. I decided to keep moving in what I thought was an eastern direction. The walls of the canyon widened again slightly, enough that I could move faster. I thought I saw a ridge up ahead, so I aimed for it. But the closer I got, the more the trail seemed to curve away. And then I reached a dead end. A sheer cliff rose in front of me, blocking the path completely. No way to climb it, no way around. I turned to go back the way I came, but I couldn't tell where that was anymore. Every direction looked like it could be the one I came from. I started to feel lightheaded. I forced myself to sit, drink some water, and calm down. I wasn't hurt. I had supplies. I just needed to think. I turned on the emergency beacon. It blinked slowly, sending out a signal, but I had no idea if it would be picked up. The rental service said response could take hours, even longer if weather or terrain interfered. I set it on a rock and waited. As I sat there, time dragged. The sun began dipping lower. The shadows stretched across the canyon floor like fingers. I ate a half of one energy bar and took tiny sips of water. I didn't want to use up anything too quickly. I didn't want to admit I might be spending the night out there. By the time the sun dropped behind the walls completely, I accepted it. I was going to have to sleep there. I found a spot against the wall with some shelter from wind and used my pack as a backrest. I had a thin thermal blanket, so I wrapped it around myself and sat there, watching the stars appear above. That night was long. I didn't sleep much. Every small sound made me flinch. I heard pebbles fall, maybe from small animals or just wind. I felt bugs crawl across my boots. I kept thinking about mountain lions, even though I knew attacks were rare. Still, fear played games in my head. I kept the headlamp close, turning it on every now and then just to see the walls and remind myself where I was. At some point around 3 a.m., I saw lights in the distance, faint and blinking. I grabbed the beacon, still on, still blinking. I waved my headlamp in the direction of the lights, flashing it over and over. The lights didn't get closer. I kept watching until they faded. Maybe a plane overhead, maybe another hiker, maybe nothing. When the sky finally lightened with the first signs of dawn, I felt like I could breathe again. I stood slowly, stretched my stiff legs, and packed up. I decided to try climbing one of the canyon walls where the slope wasn't as steep. It took almost an hour, slipping and scrambling, but I finally made it to the top of a ridge. From there, I saw something that nearly brought me to tears. The main trail, maybe half a mile away. I practically stumbled down the ridge, sliding on loose gravel, scraping my hands and shins, but I didn't care. I reached the trail, dropped to my knees and laughed. I was out. About an hour later, I made it back to the parking area. My car was still there, covered in dust. I checked my phone. 5 missed calls from the beacon service. They had picked up my signal, but the terrain delayed their ability to pinpoint my exact location. They were going to send someone that morning. I called them back, told them I was okay, and canceled the rescue. I drove straight back to town, hands still shaking. That night, I slept in a motel bed. The sound of the air conditioner the most comforting thing I had ever heard. I still hike. I still love it. But I don't go off-trail anymore. No shortcuts. No solo trips without telling someone exactly where I'll be. I learned the hard way that nature doesn't care how prepared you think you are. One wrong turn and it all falls apart. And the scariest part? It doesn't take monsters or ghosts to make you feel like you're in a nightmare. Sometimes, all it takes is silence, red rock walls, and the slow, creeping realization that you are completely, utterly alone. I'm not proud of what happened. In fact, I've never told anyone the full story. People think they know what they're doing when they go out into the wilderness. I was one of those people. I had experience, sure. I'd done over 50 hikes, camped solo, carried my own pack for days, even done some mild mountaineering. I thought I understood the rules. I thought I was careful. But all it took was one mistake, a small one, and everything went sideways. It happened in early September. I had taken a week off work and planned a solo hike through a place I hadn't explored before, the Cedar Ridge Trail in northern Utah. It's not the most well-known place, and that's partly why I picked it. Less foot traffic, more isolation, and some stunning views from what I read online. The plan was simple. 5 days of hiking, carrying all my gear, starting from the south end of the loop and making my way clockwise around the ridge, then back down to the car I'd parked at a designated trailhead. I had topo maps printed, a loaded GPS, extra food, batteries, layers, even a satellite beacon. I thought I was prepared for everything. The first 2 days went smooth. The weather was cold at night, but clear. Mornings were chilly, afternoons bright and breezy. I passed through thick pine forests, then wide meadows full of golden grass, then started climbing along rocky switchbacks until I was walking the spine of the ridge. Views on both sides were incredible, jagged peaks in the distance, long valleys below. I made camp the second night on a flat spot just under some wind-blown trees. Felt remote, untouched. I didn't see a single other person. The third morning is when things started to shift. I woke up feeling off. Not sick, just not right. I thought it was the altitude or maybe that I didn't eat enough the night before. I forced down an energy bar and drank water. My legs felt heavy and I moved slower than usual. Still, I pushed on. The trail got narrower and more exposed the higher I went. The ridge turned rocky, with steep drop-offs to the east side. It wasn't dangerous if you paid attention, but there was no room for mistakes. Around noon, clouds began forming, thicker than I expected. I had checked the weather report the night before the trip, and it said mostly clear with a small chance of light rain on day 4. But these clouds didn't look like light rain. They were dark and heavy and rolled in fast. By 1 p.m., thunder rumbled in the distance. I checked the topo map. There was no shelter up here. No caves, no big rocks to crouch behind, just low bushes and exposed ridgeline. The safest thing to do was descend to the forested valley on the western slope. There was a side trail marked on the map, a dotted line that broke off from the ridge and curved downward into a gulch. It looked doable. Steep, but better than staying exposed during a storm. I found the trail, but it was hard to follow. Overgrown, barely used. A few cairns marked the beginning, but after 15 minutes, they disappeared. I pushed through thick brush, ducked under branches, and scrambled down wet rocks as the drizzle turned into full-on rain. The temperature dropped fast. I slipped twice but caught myself. My pants and sleeves were soaked, but I kept moving. I figured I'd make it down to the tree line, set up my tarp, wait out the worst of the storm, then either return to the ridge or follow the valley out depending on conditions. I didn't realize I had veered off the trail until it was too late. It happened gradually. I was so focused on footing and speed that I didn't check my GPS often enough. The trees thickened, and the slope angled harder west than it should have. I checked the map again, and my stomach dropped. I wasn't on the dotted line anymore. I was at least half a mile west of it, maybe more. The problem was, now the slope was too steep and slick to easily climb back up. It was already late afternoon. The storm was still going. The wind howled through the trees, making it hard to hear anything else. I knew I needed to find a place to camp, somewhere flat and dry enough to pitch the tarp and ride it out. I kept moving downhill, scanning for clearings. The ground was slick with mud and pine needles. I tripped on a hidden root and slid several feet before hitting a tree with my hip. The pain shot up my side. Nothing broke, but it was enough to slow me down. By dusk, the rain finally eased off, but everything around me was soaked. I managed to find a small flat spot between two big trees. Not perfect, but it would have to do. I strung the tarp between the trunks and crawled under it, shivering. My clothes were wet. My sleeping bag was in a dry sack, thank God, but the ground was too wet to lay it directly on. I used my foam pad, but water still seeped in. I lay there cold, wet, and exhausted, listening to branches snap in the wind and hoping nothing worse would happen. The next morning, fog hung low in the trees. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. My GPS battery was lower than it should have been. Maybe the cold drained it faster overnight. I swapped in fresh ones and tried to get a signal. It was weak but enough to see my location. I was deep in the wrong part of the forest with no trail in sight. I could try to climb back up and find the ridge again or go west into the gulch and hope it connected with the main trail eventually. I chose west. That was mistake number 2. The terrain got worse. Thicker underbrush, steeper drops. I had to bushwhack for hours, checking the GPS every 10 minutes. My hands were scratched, my legs ached, and the ridge was no longer visible behind me. I slipped crossing a creek and soaked my boots. They squished with every step after that. The map said there might be an old logging road near the valley floor, but I never found it. Either it had washed out years ago or I missed it entirely. By late afternoon, I was beyond tired. My hips still throbbed. I hadn't eaten much all day. I found a patch of dry ground near a boulder and set up camp again. That night, something moved around outside my tarp. I couldn't see what it was. I stayed still, heart racing, hand on my knife. Probably just a deer or a raccoon. But when you're alone in the woods and disoriented, every sound becomes sharper, more threatening. The next morning, the GPS refused to turn on. Both sets of batteries were dead. I had a compass and a map, but the forest was so thick I couldn't see landmarks to triangulate. I guessed my position and aimed northwest, hoping to hit the main trail or the service road that wrapped around the loop. But I kept running into ravines, thick deadfall, steep cliffs that weren't marked on the map. I must have been in an area that had changed since the topo was printed. Landslides, floods, who knows. That day dragged. No trails, no signs, no clearings. Just endless forest and climbing over fallen trees. I rationed my food down to a granola bar and a handful of almonds. My water filter still worked, but the stream I passed was low and full of debris. I boiled it just in case. The next night was colder. My tarp flapped in the wind all night. Something howled in the distance, likely a coyote. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept going over everything I did wrong. I knew better than to leave a marked trail. I knew better than to push down a slope without checking my location. Every mistake piled on top of the last, and now I was lost, tired, and slowly running out of supplies. The fourth day, I reached what looked like a dry creek bed. It ran northeast, which I hoped would lead me back toward the loop. I followed it for hours. At one point, I saw a flash of orange, a trail marker or flagging tape. I pushed toward it and found nothing, just a patch of dead leaves catching light in a weird way. False hope. I screamed once, not out of panic, just raw frustration. It echoed between the trees and came back sounding hollow. I kept walking. My hip hurt worse. My left foot was blistered. I could feel my energy dropping. I started talking to myself, not out loud, just inside, keeping myself alert. Left, right, left. Drink, eat, breathe, keep going. By day 5, I was almost out of food. I ate the last of my trail mix that morning and left my empty wrappers in a Ziploc. My stomach growled constantly. I started chewing on pine needles just to have something in my mouth. My vision blurred now and then from low blood sugar, but I kept walking. That afternoon, I saw something that made me freeze. A boot print, not mine. A real, fresh print in the mud near a stream. I dropped to my knees and touched it. Deep, heel to toe, recent. I scanned around, nothing, but I followed where it pointed. An hour later, I saw the trail. It wasn't marked, not clearly, but it was there. A worn path with faint footprints, flattened grass, and snapped twigs. I followed it uphill, heart pounding. It curved slowly northwest, then turned east. And just when I started to worry it might be an animal trail or a dead end, I saw the sign. Weathered wood nailed to a post, barely legible. Ridge Loop Connector Trail, 2.5 miles. I cried. Just sat down on the trail and cried for a solid 5 minutes. Then I got up and walked. The trail was steep, but I didn't care. My legs burned, but I didn't care. I just kept going, 1 foot in front. I had always loved hiking. The quiet, the rhythm of walking, the feeling of being far away from the world. I used to go with friends, but over the years people got busy with work, families, and other priorities. I never stopped. Sometimes I'd go with someone, but most of the time I ended up hiking alone. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. Last summer, I planned a solo trip to a lesser-known national forest in Idaho. It wasn't some tourist-heavy place like Yellowstone or Yosemite. It was out of the way, not very popular, but it had beautiful landscapes. Long valleys, high ridgelines, cold streams, and quiet woods. I had found it by scrolling through some forums where hikers share hidden gems. A few posts said the trail was poorly marked and that you needed good map reading skills, but I had experience. I thought I could handle it. The plan was simple. Hike in for 2 days, camp by a lake I saw on the map, then hike back the same way. I packed light but smart food for 4 days, water filter, a basic tent, sleeping bag, knife, first aid kit, compass, and a detailed topographic map printed out and sealed in a plastic sleeve. I also had a GPS device clipped to my backpack. I let my brother know my plan and told him I'd text him once I got back in cell range. I drove up early in the morning. The trailhead was just a small gravel turnout off a forest road with a faded wooden sign nailed to a tree. There were no other cars there. I parked, got my gear out, stretched my legs, and started walking. The first day was beautiful. The trail was rough in places, lots of fallen trees, some washed out areas, but nothing too bad. It wound through thick forest, crossed a shallow creek, and climbed gradually into the hills. I didn't see anyone else all day. No other hikers, no hunters, no campers. Just me and the woods. I made camp near a flat open area above a small stream. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal on my small stove, and watched the sun go down between the trees. It got cold fast, so I climbed into my sleeping bag early. I slept well. The second day, I packed up and continued up the ridge. I had marked a spot on the map where the trail forked toward the lake. It wasn't a well-traveled path, but it was visible enough. After a few hours of climbing and crossing some rocky switchbacks, I reached the fork and turned off toward the lake. That's when things started to go a little wrong. The trail got thinner, more overgrown. It was clear this path wasn't used much. I kept checking the map and compass, making sure I was on the right heading. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. I crossed a dry creek bed, passed through a section of dead pine trees, and climbed another hill. But then the trail seemed to vanish. I stopped and looked around. The trees were thicker here. The ground was uneven. I walked back a few steps to where the trail had been clearer, then forward again, trying to pick it up. I found what looked like a trail marker on a tree, just a faint, old blue paint mark, but beyond that, nothing. I looked at my map and guessed the lake should be northeast, just over the next ridge. I figured I'd bushwhack a bit and pick the trail up again on the other side. I'd done this kind of thing before. It usually worked out. It didn't this time. The ridge was steeper than I expected. Climbing it with a full pack was slow and tiring. There were loose rocks and low branches grabbing at my gear. When I finally reached the top, sweating and out of breath, I looked down the other side expecting to see the lake. But there was no lake, just more trees and a deep gully. I took out my GPS. It had been working fine until then, but when I tried to get a fix, it blinked, searching for satellites over and over. I waited, walked a bit, held it up to the sky. Still nothing. I wasn't panicking yet, but I could feel a tightness in my chest. I turned back to retrace my steps, thinking I'd return to the main trail and try again. But the way down looked different. The trees all looked the same. There was no clear path, just forest in every direction. I moved slowly, scanning for landmarks I'd passed on the way up. A strange rock, a fallen tree, anything. But I couldn't find any. I walked in what I thought was the right direction for nearly 2 hours. The ground sloped downward, then flattened, then sloped again, but I wasn't sure I was going the right way. I stopped to check the map. The terrain didn't match. I could be anywhere. That night, I set up my tent near a small clearing and built a tiny fire with some dry twigs. I tried not to think about the fact that I was probably lost. I told myself I'd find the main trail in the morning. I ate a granola bar and some jerky, then lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence. It wasn't peaceful anymore, felt too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. In the morning, I packed up and kept moving. I picked a direction based on the sun, thinking if I headed west I'd hit the road eventually. I thought about using the GPS again, but it was still dead. I took the batteries out and put them back in, but no change. I checked my compass, it still worked. So west it was. The forest got thicker. My pace slowed. I kept having to climb over logs, duck under branches, push through brush. By afternoon, my legs were sore, and my arms were scratched up. I still hadn't seen any sign of a trail or road. I sat down to rest and drink some filtered water. That's when I noticed something strange. Broken branches, some flattened grass, a faint path going downhill. I thought maybe I'd stumbled on another old trail. I followed it. The path led me into a narrow canyon. The air got cooler and damper. The trees closed in. I kept walking, thinking it might lead out the other side. But the farther I went, the darker it got. I started to get a bad feeling. The path became harder to follow, more tangled. I slipped on a damp patch of moss and scraped my elbow on a rock. That's when I heard it. It was faint, but clear. Something moving in the trees behind me. A crack, then a rustle. Then silence. I froze. My heart started pounding. I waited, listening. Another rustle, closer this time. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Maybe it was an animal. A deer. A raccoon. Something small. I told myself that and kept moving faster now. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept hearing sounds. Sticks breaking, movement just behind me. Every time I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved, always staying out of sight. I didn't want to run, but I couldn't help it. I started jogging, stumbling over roots and rocks. My backpack bounced with each step. I looked over my shoulder again and again, but saw nothing. Still, I knew something was back there. I could feel it. After about 20 minutes, I burst out of the canyon into another clearing. I dropped my pack and spun around. Nothing followed me out. The woods behind me were still, but the fear didn't leave. I stood there for a long time, breathing hard. It was late afternoon. I didn't want to camp in that canyon. I didn't even want to stay near it. I found a new spot farther up a slope, where I could see more of the forest around me. I set up my tent there, ate a little food, and kept my knife close. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I kept heading west. I started yelling now and then, just to make noise. It made me feel a little better, like I wasn't completely alone. But nothing ever answered. I passed through another valley and climbed another ridge. Still no road, still no trail. My food was running low now. I had one more meal and some snacks left. That evening, I saw something strange up ahead, a dark shape between the trees. As I got closer, I realized it was an old hunting blind, just a small wooden platform in a tree, maybe 10 feet off the ground. It looked abandoned. I climbed up and sat there for a while, trying to get a better view of the land. All I saw was more forest. But then I noticed something else. In the dirt below the blind, there were fresh prints. Big ones, too big for a deer. Deep, white. They weren't human, but they weren't bear either. I didn't know what they were, but they weren't there by accident. I got down and backed away slowly. I didn't know what I was dealing with. Maybe a moose, maybe something else. Whatever it was, it wasn't far. I camped that night in a hollow between two ridges with no fire. I didn't want to attract attention. I kept waking up every hour, listening. Every noise felt louder than it should have been. At one point, I thought I heard breathing near the tent, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. The next day, I hit the lowest point of the trip. I was hungry, tired, sore, and completely lost. I sat on a log and stared at the dirt for a long time. I thought about staying put and hoping someone would find me, but no one even knew where I was. That's when I heard it again, movement. Not behind me this time, but ahead. I stood up and moved slowly toward the sound. I didn't know why I went toward it. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe I was hoping it was another person. I pushed through the trees and saw a shape. It was a man. He was maybe 50 feet away. It was late September when I decided to go hiking alone for the first time. I'd done dozens of hikes over the past few years, but always with someone else. I liked the idea of being alone out there. Just the woods, my thoughts, and the sound of my boots crunching the trail. I was looking for something quiet, away from the noise of town. And that's how I found a lesser-known trail deep in the northern part of the state. It wasn't listed on most hiking apps. Just a small mention in an old online forum post from a few years back. The post said the trail was long, peaceful, and barely used. That sounded perfect to me. The drive to the trailhead was longer than I expected. The last 40 minutes were all gravel roads full of potholes. My little sedan wasn't built for this, and I had to go slow to keep from messing up the undercarriage. Tall pine trees flanked both sides of the road, and the farther I drove, the darker it seemed to get. Even though it was just past noon. The trailhead wasn't marked by any sign, just a little dirt clearing on the right side of the road with enough space for maybe 2 cars to park. No other vehicles were there. That didn't surprise me. I parked, grabbed my pack, locked the car, and checked my phone. No signal. I expected that. I put my phone on airplane mode to save battery and tucked it into my backpack. The trail started behind a wall of underbrush. I had to duck under some branches to even find the path. But once I did, it was clear enough. Narrow, a little overgrown in spots, but walkable. The air was damp and cool, and everything smelled like moss and wet pine needles. Birds chirped above me, and I could hear the faint sound of running water somewhere off to the right. I started walking, planning to go in about 10 miles before setting up camp and heading back the next day. The first few miles were beautiful. Ferns lined both sides of the trail. I saw a couple of deer off in the trees, and squirrels darted across the path every now and then. The terrain was uneven in spots, and I had to watch my footing. Some areas were muddy from recent rain, and I slipped once but caught myself on a tree trunk. About 4 hours in, I found a flat, open area a few hundred feet off the trail, just past a bend near a rocky slope. It seemed like a good place to set up my tent. I cleared away some sticks, pitched the tent, and ate a snack. I sat there for a while just listening. The forest was quiet. A little too quiet, actually. Even the birds had stopped. I didn't think much of it at the time. Later, as I explored the area near the slope, I found a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, barely visible, hidden by fallen leaves and branches. I followed it for maybe 20 minutes, weaving through trees, until it led me to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old stone structure, maybe the foundation of a cabin that had long since fallen apart. Only parts of the stone base remained, covered in moss. I walked around it, curious. It looked like no one had been here in decades. There were no signs of life, no trash, no recent footprints. Just trees, rocks, and silence. The place felt strange, like it held a kind of weight. Not supernatural or anything like that, just heavy. I didn't stay long. When I got back to my tent, the air felt colder. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, and I decided to get a fire going before it got dark. I had packed a small bundle of dry kindling and brought a lighter, so starting the fire wasn't hard. I boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal and sat by the fire, eating and watching the flames. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Snapping twigs, rustling leaves, something moving around the edges of my camp. I told myself it was just animals. Deer, maybe raccoons. But the sounds didn't feel random. They stopped when I sat up and started again when I laid down. I finally unzipped the tent and looked around with my flashlight. Nothing, but I still felt watched. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I didn't want to stay another night. I decided to hike straight back out. No exploring, no breaks, just walk. I kept a steady pace, trying not to look behind me too often. The forest felt different now. It was like it had closed in a bit, like the trees were closer together than before. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I heard something ahead of me, like someone walking fast through the brush. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. Then I heard it again, this time off to the right, maybe 20 feet into the trees. I stepped off the trail and peered through the branches, but I couldn't see anything. I kept walking, faster now. Then I saw something strange. On the side of the trail, about chest height on a tree, someone had carved a symbol. Just 3 lines intersecting in a kind of triangle. It looked fresh. The wood was still pale where it had been cut. I hadn't seen it on the way in. I didn't stop. I kept walking. My heart was pounding now. I just wanted to get to my car. A few minutes later, I noticed the trail looked wrong. The ferns were thicker here, and I didn't remember that many rocks. I pulled out my phone to check my offline map. It didn't make sense. I was somehow going in the wrong direction. I hadn't turned off the trail, but the GPS showed me veering away from the original path. I turned around and walked back the way I came, trying to get back on track. But after another 15 minutes, I was even farther off. Something was wrong. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I pulled out my compass. North was the same direction I'd been heading. I didn't understand. It was like the trail was leading me away without changing direction. I stopped walking and listened. There it was again, movement in the trees. Not close, but steady, like something circling. I kept walking. An hour passed, then another. Still no sign of the trailhead. I was running low on water and the sun was getting lower. I didn't want to spend another night out here, especially not this deep in the woods. I finally decided to stop. I found a slightly raised area near a cluster of boulders and set up my tent again. I didn't build a fire this time. I didn't want anything or anyone to know where I was. I ate a protein bar in the dark and sat with my back against the biggest rock. I didn't sleep at all. All night I heard footsteps, not animals. Too slow, too heavy. Once, I swear I saw a figure moving between two trees about 50 feet away, but when I shined my light, nothing was there. The first light, I packed up again and just started walking. No direction, just away from where I had been. I crossed a small stream and climbed a steep hill. Then another, then another. Around mid-morning, I found a trail, not the one I came in on. This one was wide and worn, and I saw tire tracks. I followed it for maybe 5 miles before it led me to a dirt service road. From there, I walked another mile before I saw a ranger truck. I waved it down, and the guy inside gave me a weird look, said I was lucky, said no one goes that deep out there. I didn't explain, I just nodded. I got a ride back to my car. It was untouched, exactly where I'd left it. I drove home in silence. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not because I was scared they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to remember it. I don't hike alone anymore, not after that, and I'll never go back to that trail. Even if I could find it again, I wouldn't dare.